All right. I like you guys. You're clapping for me. I haven't even said anything yet. All right. Can everybody hear me? Even back there in the cheap seats? Okay. Excellent. All right. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about stress and sleep and emotion. But I'm really going to put the most emphasis on sleep today because it really is the most powerful tool that each and every one of us have at our disposal if we want to maximize our brain's potential and if we want to age well in terms of cognition. Now, if you think about your brain, it's really behind everything you do, right? It's behind your thoughts. It's behind your ability to learn and remember. It's behind your ability to make decisions, to concentrate, to regulate emotions, and to do really just about everything that makes us human. I mean, I just want you to think for a second about what it would be like if you literally couldn't remember anything or if you couldn't learn anything new, okay? So this is really going to be a pointed and probably a little bit of an excessively emotional plea on my part to get you to take sleep more seriously. However, while I'm going to be talking about sleep today, I'm going to put it in a more holistic framework because it turns out that you really can't talk about sleep without also talking about stress. Now, most of you already know this, right? How many of you have been stuck, at least for a night or two, in what I like to call the sleep-stress snowball? All right, so you're already nodding your heads. You already know what this is, right? This often starts with a stressor. It could be a bad day at work. It could be a loss. It could actually be something traumatic. But it starts with something very stressful that leads to poor sleep. What you may not know is that when you're not sleeping, you're actually secreting huge amounts of stress hormones, like cortisol. So now you're not sleeping, which is making you more stressed. The more stressed you are, the less you're sleeping, and round you go in this very pernicious sleep stress snowball. So I'm going to talk about how these interact, because the interaction turns out to be very important, whether you're talking about stress, sleep, and the brain in terms of my laboratory research or in terms of really just basic human experience. But like I said, I'm going to start by putting a lot of emphasis on sleep. And I'm going to sound like your mother for a few minutes, because it turns out she was right when she told you to get your sleep. All right? We just didn't understand why until fairly recently in terms of neuroscience and psychology research. All right, now I've already told you sleep literally is one of the most powerful tools that you have available to you if you want to maximize your cognitive and neuronal potential. And we've actually known that for over a century. What's interesting to me is that in spite of that, I mean, imagine if somebody gave you a pill and said, this is going to, make you smarter, it's going to make you less fat, it's going to make you happier, and we would all probably buy it. Well, it turns out we don't need a pill, okay? It turns out we don't need a pill. We have it all right there waiting for us. And that is simply learning to get better sleep, which we'll talk about, and to protect our sleep rather than what we really do in this culture, which is to, I would say, abuse and disrespect sleep. Now, and what I mean by that, how many of you have heard somebody say, oh, I'll sleep when I'm dead? Okay, you want to know what my answer to that is? My response is, yeah, and you'll be dead a lot sooner, and in the meantime, you'll be a lot stupider. Because it's true. And yet, there's something to that. There's something to that idea that there's almost something slovenly and lazy about sleep. Like, really, we shouldn't have to do it very much. People wear their sleep deprivation like a badge of honor, right? And I really think it's part of this first one in, last one out mentality, which confuses me because we know in terms of the way the brain works that it just doesn't work that way. I mean, your brain absolutely needs to go offline. And sleep is the champion gold standard offline brain state. I mean, so in online, offline, right now you're all online, right? You're paying attention. Actually, you're online even if you're checking your phone, okay? Which means we're not going offline as much as we used to, because offline can also be, you're just kind of looking at the clouds, or you're taking a relaxing walk, or you're just letting your mind wander, Okay, so those are all offline states, which we'll also talk about because they're also beneficial, but sleep really is the champion offline state. Our brains just didn't evolve to do two things at the same time. We can't both what we call encode new information, which is what you're doing right now, you're learning new information. We can't do that while simultaneously consolidating that information. And what that means is taking that new information and making memories out of it that last over the long term. It also means taking information and transforming it in ways that allow us to see patterns, to come up with insights, and to do other really uniquely human feats of cognition that make us smart. So you can't do both at the same time. We really should be constantly and throughout the day going online and then offline, and then online and then offline. And when I see students on campus, they're not just walking across campus even talking to each other anymore. And they're certainly not daydreaming. They're like this, nearly bumping into you. So I worry a lot about that. And I especially worry about the fact that they're not sleeping. So when I talk about people wearing sleep deprivation as a badge of honor, I mean, you all know that man or that woman who only needs 3 hours of sleep. Which, by the way, I haven't found that person yet. I've found plenty of people who say they're that person, but you bring them into the research laboratory, and first of all, they're having what are called microsleeps. They're falling asleep over and over again. They're just not aware of it. And their performance is atrocious. So that person, I won't say they don't exist, but I'll tell you they're very rare. It also shows up in the college students. This drives me crazy as a professor. So first of all, let me just say, my main research enterprise is all about learning and memory. And the two things that you need to do in order to really learn and remember what you've learned are, first, you need to do what's called staggering your practice. So you don't want to study something just once. You want to revisit it iteratively over time. There's something about studying and then going away, online, offline, online, offline, that really helps embed new knowledge in neuronal networks. So you don't want to cram. And then the second thing you don't want to do is not sleep. And what drives me crazy as a professor, this is my sister in the front row who's also a professor, and I'll bet it drives her crazy as well, is when you walk by normally the library and you hear students bragging about how little sleep they got the night before the test because they're such hard workers. Oh, well, I only got 3 hours of sleep. Oh, I pulled an all-nighter. So what that means they're doing are the two worst things for learning and memory. They're cramming, and they're doing it across a night of sleep deprivation, which means sure they'll get an A on the test, because these are smart kids, after all, especially at Notre Dame. They're hard workers, but they will not be able to remember that information very well in the long run. So how did we get here? I mean, for me, it's a bit of a mystery. And I've gotten a little philosophical about it. Like, why is it that the data are so clear that sleep is good for the brain and good for cognition? And yet we live in this society where we say things like, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And I really think it might have to do with the fact that we're descendants of Puritans. And it really is part of this work ethic where we feel like we always ought to be working, and that working longer means working harder. That's not true. Your brain actually learns and operates better if you take these offline breaks, and especially if you pay attention to and protect the most important one, which is the offline brain state of sleep. All right, I know I'm on a soapbox. I can't help it. I'm actually pretty passionate about this because it's bizarre to me that I actually have to get up here and say this. I'm not Catholic myself, but I'm now at a Catholic university, so I've started to talk about the Holy Trinity of Health. Doesn't this have a nice ring to it? Okay, and those three things are diet, exercise, and sleep. But my guess is you all know, you've been hit over the head by how important diet and exercise are. You all know that already. But you probably know correspondingly less about why sleep is so important. And so that's actually what we're going to talk about today, is what does sleep do for your brain? And the first thing it does is it makes you perform a lot better. And I also do these types of lectures, workshops for corporations, and I get a lot of pushback. Look, this is just such a busy 24/7 society. We just can't get the sleep we need anymore. It's just not possible. It's structurally impossible. And I like to push back against that and say, okay, well, if we're going to just submit to that, if we're just going to say, hey, we're a culture of walking zombies and there's nothing we can do about it, if we're going to say we're going to go to work sleep deprived, we're going to pick up our kids sleep deprived, we're going to do a whole host of important things sleep deprived, I say, well, if we're going to be sleep deprived, then guess what? We ought to be drunk. We might as well be drunk, but we are going to be having a lot less fun. right? Now, I really want you to pay attention to this because it's important. You all know this. Every single person in this audience knows that the drunker you get, the worse your performance gets, right? I mean, you could be maybe a cooler, more interesting audience than most, but most of you would accept this, right? That you can't, the more you drink, the more your blood alcohol level goes up, the more your performance suffers. What you may not know is that exact same relationship holds for sleep deprivation, okay? So this is accumulating sleep deprivation, which means the more sleep deprived you get, the more impaired your performance. In fact, it's the same relationship. And for those of you who are statistically savvy in this audience, you're gonna notice that the slope of this line is actually steeper, and these dots hug it a little more closely than this, which actually means that sleep deprivation is probably a little worse for performance than intoxication. And yet think about it, you would never dream of showing up to work drunk. You would never dream of picking up your child or your grandchild drunk. And yet we routinely not only do these types of things, many of us brag about it. Now, you might be wondering, on the y-axis up here, it says mean relative performance. Well, the reason it says that is because we now know this applies to basically any type of performance we can measure. But this initial study, what we're measuring here is driving simulation performance. So how many accidents people get into. All right, so right there, that ought to raise some awareness. Now, you may not be aware of this, but sleep deprivation was a major factor behind tragic events like the Exxon Valdez disaster, the Challenger explosion. It's just harder to measure, okay? Because by the time somebody makes a mistake, you know, now they're aroused, they've got stress hormones pumping through their body and their brains, and you can't tell in the same way that you can by measuring their blood alcohol level. All right, this may change. They're now they're only in fancy cars so far, but just like you have really, really fast eye movements and rapid eye movement sleep, when you're drifting off to sleep, you actually have these slow rolling eye movements, and there are some fancy cars that have a monitor trained on your eye, it's usually in the rearview mirror, that actually looks for that and will set off an alarm when that starts happening. Okay, so it may be that one day we're able to measure people's mistakes and actually make them, you know, pay for them in the same way we do if somebody kills somebody when they're drunk driving. So in a way, this is all you need to know, is that sleep deprivation really is this bad. But I keep talking about sleep. What do I mean by it? Sleep is actually a misnomer. Sleep is not a singular unitary thing. It's actually a collection of brain states that are vastly different from one another. So different from one another that rapid eye movement sleep, for example, has more in common with wakefulness than it does with the other sleep stages. So what I'm going to show you right now is what's called a sleep histogram. If you were to come to my lab and we did a sleep study, which is actually pretty non-invasive, we just attach electrodes to your head, okay? I can tell what stage of sleep you're in by looking at your brain waves. And here's what should happen when sleep is operating as it should. This is a good night of sleep. So the first thing that ought to happen is sleep onset ought to occur very quickly. In fact, if you're routinely laying there awake in bed, ruminating for 20 to 30 minutes a night, and if that's associated with any kind of daytime complaint, like I don't feel well, that's all it takes to get a diagnosis of insomnia. That's one type of insomnia. That's called sleep initiation insomnia. There's another one that's called sleep maintenance insomnia, which happens when rapid eye movement sleep gets super abundant right around here. I call it the 3 a.m. screamies. How many of you have done this, woken up in the middle of the night and you can't get back to sleep? Just as common, in fact, as we age, a little more common than sleep initiation insomnia. Okay, but those are the two types of insomnia. Ideally, if you wake up, you ought to go right back to sleep. When you try to go to sleep at the beginning of the night, that ought to happen pretty quickly. And in the beginning of your sleep cycle, after you fall asleep, you ought to descend down into what we call slow wave sleep, which is stages 3 and 4 combined, and this is the deepest type of sleep we get. There's a misconception out there in the world that rapid eye movement sleep is actually a deep stage of sleep. Did any of you think that before coming in here? It's actually not. It's a very, very active brain state, as we'll discuss, and it's perfectly normal to wake up out of that one. But slow wave sleep is so deep, you do not want to wake up out of slow wave sleep because, and this will become pertinent when we talk in a minute about strategic napping, the last type of sleep you want to wake up out of is slow wave sleep because it's not going to benefit performance, it's not going to help, it's not going to make you feel better. Instead, you're going to feel groggy and cranky and awful. The brain really wants to be locked in, and as you can see, you get the vast majority of slow wave sleep in the beginning of the night. Now I want you to juxtapose that or compare that with rapid eye movement sleep, which you see in the red bars here, which gets more prevalent later in the night. And in fact, here you have somebody who's waking up out of rapid eye movement sleep, which is, I just said, perfectly fine. And in fact, the more often you wake up out of rapid eye movement sleep, the more you're likely to remember your dreams. Because the vast majority of dreaming happens in rapid eye movement sleep. However, dreaming actually happens all throughout the night. We truly have a 24-hour mind. It's just that if I wake you up in a different type of sleep and say, report to me what you were thinking about, if I wake you up out of slow wave sleep, you'll report something that just looks more like a memory. Oh, I was thinking about talking to my mom, which I did earlier that day. If I wake you up out of REM, you were being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, and then you tried to fly away, and then that tiger turned into your mother-in-law, and you wake up. She'll probably come up a couple more times. You wake up absolutely traumatized. But really, rapid eye movement sleep dreams are the characteristic dreams in the sense that they're really, really fragmented, often highly emotional, almost always very bizarre, but sometimes amazingly creative, okay? But really and truly, dreaming happens all throughout the night. So as you can see, you get the vast majority of your deep slow wave sleep here early in the night. In fact, if I sleep deprive you and then measure your brain waves, the brain waves behind slow wave sleep are much bigger. It's like the brain fights to get this back. It fights to get it back first. Not only does slow wave sleep come first in the natural sleep cycle, but if I keep you up all night, when I finally let you go to bed, you're going to produce a lot of slow wave sleep and very intense brain waves that actually are associated with it. But actually, the brain will fight to get back any type of sleep it's deprived of. And then there's another type of sleep that I'll mention, which is called, not very creatively, stage 2 non-REM sleep. And as you can see, that's pretty equally distributed throughout the night. Now, each of these different types of sleep does something very important for you in terms of your cognition. So slow wave sleep, that's where almost all of your memory consolidation occurs. So that ability you have to wake up tomorrow morning and remember what I've said today, which hopefully you will, is dependent in large part on slow wave sleep. Right? It plays a big role in it. So slow wave sleep is really important for learning and memory. Rapid eye movement sleep is equally important, but for emotional memory and processing emotions in general, especially negative emotions like fear and anxiety. But it's also important for emotion regulation, which is the ability to sort of tamp down that negativity. And it's also important for creativity, which may not be surprising, given that some of those rapid eye movement sleep dreams can be so creative. And then when it comes to stage 2 sleep, it does a little bit of everything. We think it might jumpstart the memory consolidation process and also helps you integrate information so that you can see connections and make generalizations and come up with ways to find commonalities in information. So all of these different states of sleep actually do something for you, and they do something very, very important. Now, I just want to get a sense, so I just want you to shout out the answer. How many hours of sleep do you think human beings need each day? 7. Okay, I'm hearing mostly 8, and here's the thing about 8. It drives me a little bit crazy because it turns out that 8 is just an average. Human sleep, like many human variables, is normally distributed, right? This is the normal or the bell curve. And so where we get this number of 8 is that the vast, overwhelming majority of you need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours a night. But 8 is just an average, so in some sense it doesn't necessarily represent anybody. I mean, it's not a bad thing to shoot for, but when the media says get your 8 hours, I'm afraid people take that literally. Because you may very well need 7, you may very well need 9. All of that is where most of us fall. But as you can see here, this is the normal distribution. So there are people out there who only need 4. And I mean need. I want us to get rid of this idea of what I can get by on. I mean, there are people out there who only need 4, but they are so statistically rare, I have not found one of them yet. Okay, like I said, I found a lot of people who claim that, but it doesn't turn out to be true. There are also people out there who need 12. And what I'm going to talk about right now is that when somebody says to me, look, I think I might be a long sleeper, I think I need 12 hours, and I ask, why do you say that? Their answer is usually, well, because I sleep and I sleep and I sleep, but I never feel rested. That actually raises the specter of sleep apnea. That's much more likely to be a case of sleep apnea. Now, for those of you that don't know, what an apnea is it's a complete cessation of breath, which means you're brain is 100% deprived of oxygen. And get this, in the worst cases of apnea, which are not rare, people will have 100 or more of these apnea events an hour. Your brain has to arouse to get a breath. So rather than seeing these beautiful sleep stages as somebody's going throughout the night, what we see on the EEG is awakening, 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 awakening. They just don't remember those awakenings. So those people aren't really sleeping at all. Their sleep is terribly fractured, and they're not getting very much. So of course they feel tired the next day. Now look, I always hope to save a couple of lives here, because apnea is becoming increasingly common. It becomes more common the more weight we gain. It's more common in men than it is women, because women, we tend to carry our weight down here. Men tend to carry it up higher, including around their neck. But I've seen this in football players, where it's just muscle. Anything that puts pressure on your neck is going to collapse your airway and leads to these apnea events. Now, loud snoring, really loud snoring, is already a bad enough sign, but that's not, I mean, it's argued, I will say a sleep disorder per se, but if that snoring turns into choking, gasping, coughing, or you can tell somebody is having these cessations of breath, that person needs to go get a sleep study done. And the reason is because we now know, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that apnea is correlated with heart attacks and stroke. And yet it's treatable. I mean, I've seen people lose as few as, because most of us tend to lose weight around our face and neck first, right? I've seen people lose just as few as 5 or 10 pounds, and the apnea starts getting better, okay? Now, it's not the only cause of apnea, but it's the biggest one. So if you hear somebody, like your bed partner, spouse, somebody you love, is actually choking and gasping, please have them go get a sleep study done, okay? Frankly, I think we all ought to have a baseline one done at like 25, but you know, I'm not out there, you know, determining social policy, unfortunately. All right. Now, if there's a slide that I want you to remember forever, it's this one, okay? It's this fact, which is that your sleeping brain, far from being switched off, is actually highly, intensively active. And why am I making a big deal out of that? It's because if you go out and you talk to people and ask, well, what is sleep? What's it for? What does it do? You're inevitably going to get answers like, well, it's just a time of rest and restoration, right? Or rejuvenation. But it's a time when sort of the brain, the body are powered down so they can rest. And embedded in that is this idea that the brain is switched off or inactivated, and literally nothing could be further from the truth. Your brain is actually incredibly active when you're sleeping, and it's active in the very regions you need it to be if you're going to be cognitively fit. Now, I promise not to geek out too much on the neuroscience, but the regions I'm about to talk about aren't just active during sleep, in this case during rapid eye movement sleep. They are more active than when you're wide awake. And what regions are these? Well, first and foremost, the hippocampus. Okay, the hippocampus and surrounding cortex, more active during sleep than during wakefulness. Your hippocampus, it's actually a bilateral structure, okay, you have two of them. That is the seat of memory. So important is it for memory that if you were to, drill a hole through your temples, which I do not recommend because you'd become profoundly amnesic, you would literally not ever be able to learn anything new. This structure is so important for learning and memory. More active during sleep than wakefulness. Right next door, the amygdala, these are pretty primitive structures, by the way. The amygdala is incredibly important, but it's important for processing emotion, especially emotions that are negative like anxiety and fear. More active in REM sleep than when you're awake. And you might wonder, well, is that a good thing? It is actually a good thing to process your negative emotions, but what's even better is that it's doing it alongside activation in a part of your prefrontal cortex, which is a more newly evolved part of the brain, called the anterior cingulate and surrounding cortex, which is actually essential for emotion regulation. So you're processing all of these negative emotions, but you're doing it with the regulatory control system in the anterior cingulate that sort of keeps that from getting out of control. So you're processing the negative, but you're dialing it down so that you learn from it, but you don't develop an anxiety disorder. You don't develop clinical depression. That's when all things are working well. So these are just some of the areas that are so important for our day-to-day cognition that are more active. Now, so you're not wasting time when you sleep. If I can just get people to understand that sleep is actually doing something for you, doing something really important that makes you smarter, then maybe people will give it the respect it deserves, right? Now, I just have to tell you something really cool, which is there's another area of the prefrontal cortex called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex up here that's actually completely deactivated during rapid eye movement sleep. And what's interesting about this is that this is the part of the brain that literally tells me I can't fly across the auditorium right now, and I can't walk through that wall, right? So it's a good system. It's really good that it's on right now. But it's switched off, okay, during rapid eye movement sleep. And what can you do in your dreams? That's absolutely right. The sky is literally the limit. The other thing that's interesting about this is that this structure, we call it the executive control center of the brain. It's responsible for rationality. You can think about it as a CEO of the brain, but it's a really boring CEO. Okay, it's very literal and linear, and this is a CEO who doesn't want to think outside of the box, doesn't want to try anything new, kind of wants to stick with what we've been doing because we know it works, doesn't want to try new ideas. Well, it's switched off. So what does that mean? You've got a brain that's processing all of this information, all these memories, all these emotions, but it's doing it in the absence of this, sort of stern, stentorian dictator that says, I don't want to try that new idea. So this may be another reason that rapid eye movement sleep is so important for insight, innovation, and creativity. Now, it's not going to surprise you that I built the better part of my research career, given what I've just said here, showing that sleep improves memory. And if we only had time, what I would love to do, well, first of all, I have to get your approval, because instead of just showing you data from an experiment, I'd like to turn you into temporary research subjects, okay? I'd love to test your memories. Do I have your permission? I'm not gonna get informed consent, so don't sue me. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put up a list of words, and all you have to do is pay attention, because I'm gonna test your memories later. Okay, don't be scared. It's not that bad. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Okay, what I was about to say before is what would be fun if we had more time, given that, I want to prove to you that sleep is better for memory than wakefulness, would be if we could divide this room in half, and I'd keep you guys awake for the next 10 minutes involved in scintillating conversation with me, and I'd put this side of the room to bed for 10 minutes, because some of you look like you could use it. I'm just kidding. Although, you know what? I may be the only professor in the known world who is actually complimented when my students fall asleep during my lectures. Because I don't think, they're bored. I think, no, this is so important to them that of course they're gonna put their head down and start consolidating these essential memories. But anyway, we don't have time to do the real-time comparison, so instead, let's just all play along. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna put up some words, and if the word was on the list I just showed you, I want you to raise your hand, okay? None of this, confidence, right? And then if the word wasn't there, just keep your hand down. Fair enough? Are you ready for the first word? Okay, here we go. Excellent memories. Very impressive. All right, next word. Very good. Next word. Very, very good. Next word. Okay, great. Next word. But it wasn't there. No. It is not the presence of a synonym in the form of the word physician on that list that just made you have what is technically a false memory error, right? That word wasn't there. And the reason I say it's not the synonym is because you know how we create these lists? It'd be easy. I'd say, I want all of you to generate the first 12 words that come to mind when I give you the word window or the word mountain, all right? So yes, if you just raised your hand, you technically had a false memory, but what you actually did is something that's really beneficial, because what you really did was you extracted out the overall gist, right? Or meaning of that list. Think about it. If you went home and talked about this to one of your friends or your significant other, you wouldn't say, this professor put up a list consisting of the words, nurse, sick, lawyer, medicine. You're not Spock. You'd say she talked about doctors. She put up a list about doctors. Think about how much information you are bombarded by on a day-to-day basis. If you couldn't do this, if you couldn't just sort of extract out the gist and see the forest through the trees, you'd be glutted. So it turns out to be a very important human ability, and it's something we do even when the word to which all of these are related wasn't actually there, okay? And these lists don't always have a synonym. The brain does it automatically, because what you want to say is, hey, yeah, that's a list about doctors. But what's interesting about this is now we can measure performance in two ways. We can look at your ability to recall the words that were really there, like nurse, sick, and lawyer, and we can also measure your ability to just extract. So we can look at performance in two ways. And here are the data. Okay, this is from an experiment where we're actually looking at a night of sleep versus a day of wakefulness. And I want to unpack this for you a little bit, because what we're comparing all of it to at 0 here is just memory after a 20-minute delay, right? Which is usually better. I mean, if I gave you a bunch of stuff to study and I asked you, do you want me to test you in 20 minutes or in 8 hours, you'd probably pick 20 minutes because it's normally easier to remember things over the short term than the long term. And that's exactly what you're seeing here, is that in the wait group, these studied words that really were on the list, like nurse, you're just showing a lot of forgetting. Okay, that's real precipitous forgetting in the wait group. But what if you sleep on it? In the sleep group, you still see forgetting, but you see significantly less. So one way to think about sleep and what it does for you is it protects you against forgetting. And that's already interesting, but what I think is more fascinating is what happens to your ability to just extract, which goes down in the wait group, but it's something you actually get better at if you sleep. Now, this pattern actually is really what I'm known for. It's not just that sleep benefits memory, it's that sleep selectively enhances certain information at the expense of other information. So for any experiment I've set up, sleep doesn't just sort of slavishly consolidate everything you put into the brain. Instead, even while you're deeply asleep, the brain is making calculations, if you will, about what's important to remember or highlight or prioritize, and what's okay to de-emphasize or to just forget. So there's always something that goes up and above baseline. Here it's the gist, sometimes it's emotional content, other times it's something that you have to remember to do prospectively, but the brain always shows this selective pattern of performance, which means the sleeping brain isn't stupid, right? It's actually really smart, because it really is still processing information even while you're asleep, which again is why it should not be the first thing to go when you get busy and stressed. It should be the last. But there's more, because sleep doesn't just benefit memory and just extraction, it also benefits just about any type of insight or creativity we can measure in the lab. And I could show you a bunch of data, but instead I'm just going to tell you that we've known this for hundreds of years. And there are many anecdotal examples out there in the literature, and this is one of them. Okay, so this is Kekule, and Kekule is trying to figure out the structure of benzene. You don't have to know what benzene is, it's just a molecule, it's really important for life, and he's trying to figure out its physical structure. And he's at an impasse, right? He's stuck. And we actually know that these impasses precede insights a lot of the time. So, but rather than continuing to work on it, he really does what all of us should do, which is that he takes a nap. And in his case, he has a visionary dream. So as he's napping, he starts to see these molecules that he's studying, and they start to gamble before his eyes. I love the way this guy writes. And all of a sudden, they start to kind of line up in a circular shape, and then that circle turns into a snake biting its own tail, and wham! In a flash of insight, he wakes up with that image in mind and realizes that the structure of benzene is this roughly circular hexagonal shape. And if you think he's alone, I mean, we're not even talking about the arts, all right? These are scientific examples. Otto Loewi, who discovered chemical transmission and won the Nobel Prize for it, same experience. Now, what's interesting is that sleep benefits insight. It doesn't always require that somebody remembers a component of a dream. My bet is that a lot of you have sort of slept on a problem to get to an insight or to make a decision. In fact, how many of you have done that? Most of you have, right? So we already know that sleep and other offline brain states, like being in the shower, benefit this ability to sort through information and find different solutions, with sleep, again, being the champion offline brain state, okay? And then finally, I want to show you that sleep also is tremendously beneficial for the ability to regulate our emotions. Now, I already talked about how important it is for processing negative information, and really emotional information in general, but it also regulates it. So in this experiment, just ignore the brain for a second, we've given people a bunch of stuff to remember, and they're all images, some of which are very positive, some of which are very negative, and some of which are completely neutral. And then in this case, we're comparing people who get a good night of sleep at night to a group that we keep up all night and sleep deprive. So this time we're comparing sleep deprivation to sleep. And what we see is in the sleep deprivation group, people have terrible memory for the neutral information. They also have terrible memory for the positive. But boy, do they have spectacular, maybe too spectacular memory for the negative. So it results in what we call a negative memory bias. And in the brain, what you see is this is the bilateral amygdala. And we already talked to you about the amygdala and the role it plays in negative emotion. So when you remember a negative image, you're going to show some activity in the structure. But look at what happens when you're sleep deprived. I mean, this thing is lit up like a Christmas tree or like a firework. It's overactivated, which parallels the over-excessive memory for negative emotional information. And the reason this is happening is because you didn't sleep, which means you didn't get the benefit of that regulatory emotional network in the anterior cingulate, which puts a brake on the amygdala. Remember, when you're sleeping, you're not just processing negative emotions, but you have a system that puts a brake on it so that it doesn't get out of control, that regulates your emotions. And this is a biological warning not to get sleep deprived, but you all know this. I mean, after all, what happens if your 2-year-old kid or grandkid doesn't get their nap? Right? Cranky, slap happy, they're laughing, then they're crying. They're emotionally dysregulated. All right? And they tend to actually show more negative emotion than positive. So look, I don't worry about this happening to you if it's just one night. If you show, actually, if you think about our ancestors, if you were awake on the savannah, there was probably a reason why. You were watching out for danger. There should be a negative focus. I worry about what happens when this goes on for weeks and months and years and decades. And I think at that point, there's no wonder to me that there's now a very clear relationship between poor sleep over time and conditions like anxiety and depression, because you're not getting the regulatory benefit of sleep. Sleep is really a built-in emotion and stress regulator, and if you're not sleeping well, you're not getting it. All right, so I've talked a lot about sleep, but here's some actual advice. If you're not sleeping well, or if somebody you love is not sleeping well, here's what you do. All right, the first thing, and I think the most important, is to simply try to get 20 extra minutes of sleep each day. And there are 3 ways of doing that. You can get really religious about going to bed 20 minutes earlier, ideally after you've had a relaxing wind down, before you even try to go to sleep. The second is to sleep 20 minutes later, which applies to me because that means not hitting the snooze button. And I know there's something delicious about hitting that snooze button, but truly, if you know you're going to do that, it's better to just let the brain stay locked in. And then the third way, which actually turns out to be the best way in terms of performance enhancements, is to build in a daytime nap, okay? This really has to happen in the afternoon, and if you're gonna do what's called a power nap, it should be absolutely no longer than 20 minutes. I mean, set your alarm for 20 minutes, because I'm worried that if you even go a minute or 2 over that, you run the risk of going into that slow wave sleep that we talked about, from which you awaken so groggy. So if you want the nap to benefit your performance, you need to keep it very short. And we now know that as few as 5-6 minutes of sleep, even if somebody's not aware they're sleeping, which happens in these lighter stages of sleep like stage 2, which is where I want you, has a tremendously beneficial effect on cognition. Now, is it fair to say that some of you might be retired? Okay, I'm not calling you old, I'm just asking. And for those of you who are, and maybe if you have the right type of job, another way to nap, if you really feel like you're not getting the sleep you need at night, is to nap for 90. But you either need to sleep less than 20 or for 90 minutes. And the reason 90 is because that's how long it takes you to get through a full sleep cycle. Remember how we talked about how you go down, down into stages 3, 4 sleep, which is slow wave sleep, and then up into REM, and that back down into slow wave sleep and up into REM. Each of those cycles, ultradian cycles, takes about 90 minutes. But the problem is if you sleep in between that, you're really at risk of waking up out of slow wave sleep, which isn't beneficial at all. Even if you can't nap, that's okay. Benefit in what I like to call a sleep proxy. Take the brain offline in some other way. Do a relaxation exercise, meditate, do yoga, get out and take a reflective walk. But find another way to take the brain offline, because we know this doesn't give you the same bang for your buck that sleep does, but it's the next best thing. Finally, I can't overemphasize this, minimize distractions at night. I talked about how important a relaxing wind-down routine is before you get in bed. If you're checking stressful emails or even watching Game of Thrones right before you go to sleep, that's problematic. One, because it's arousing to the brain, but also because those, really? That can't be. That just can't be. No way. 10 minutes? Well, all right, I'm gonna have to go very fast. I'm in like some kind of time warp here. All right. Minimize distractions at night, because these devices also emit blue light. Now, blue light is great for your brain in the morning. It's terrible for your brain at night because it changes your circadian rhythm. Don't drink alcohol, caffeine, or even exercise before bed. These are exercises, really exercise and sleep are the two best things you can do for your brain, but exercising too close to bedtime is problematic because it arouses you. Now, alcohol and caffeine are interesting. Caffeine has a really long half-life of around 11 or 12 hours, so if you're struggling with sleep, you need to look at your caffeine intake and either cut it out completely or really make sure you're only consuming it in the morning. And then alcohol is really interesting. Now, the first thing I've got to say is that you all probably know that the Surgeon General recommends that men have no more than 2 alcoholic beverages a day, women have no more than 1, right? You know this? Well, long ago, I decided that I'm at least the size of a medium man, and so I at least get 2. But the thing about alcohol is that it's soporific, it'll put you to sleep, but it actually destroys sleep architecture. So you really need to make sure that you don't drink too close to bedtime, because what alcohol does is it suppresses rapid eye movement sleep. And remember how I said the brain will fight to get any kind of sleep back? So if you suppress REM, I mean, it'll help you fall asleep. But by the time your body finally metabolizes all the alcohol, you've been suppressing rapid eye movement sleep for all these hours. It's going to come on like gangbusters. It's such an active state, it's going to awaken the entire brain, and you're going to have a hard time getting back to sleep, or your sleep quality will just be destroyed. And then finally, nothing when you travel beats a good pillow, eye mask, and earplugs. Okay, so the second thing you need to know a little bit about is stress. And I don't want to scare you with a bunch of gory images, but it's true that stress is neurotoxic. Okay, it really does get under the skin to kill off and shrink brain cells. And that's what you see here happening in the hippocampus, which remember is so important for memory. But that's not to say that all stress is bad. We've actually known for a very long time that the relationship between stress and performance is such that medium or moderate levels of stress and stress hormones like cortisol, that's actually where you want to be in order to give yourself the energy to get up and get things done and get them done well. But I don't worry about people being over here so much. I worry about the fact that we're living in a society that has us, suffering catastrophically high levels of stress, especially when that stress becomes chronic. But really, this is the relationship between stress and performance. So a moderate amount of stress is actually good in general. Now, when you look at those individual regions of the brain we were talking about, the hippocampus, which again is so important for learning and memory, it shows the same pattern where it's doing its best at moderate levels, but boy, does it start to tank under high levels of stress. The amygdala, however, so important for negative emotional processing, it just ramps up and up and up and up. So what happens if you have the brain incubating in all these stress hormones, and then you give it something to learn? What happens to performance? And the example I'll tell you about here is another memory task where we basically stress people out, and then we look at their ability to remember negative versus neutral information. How do we stress them out? We have them give a speech. Well, we have freshmen give a speech. And they're giving a speech in front of a panel of judges that, unbeknownst to them, have been specially trained to not emote at all, except for to give subtle signs of displeasure. Okay? And if that's not bad enough, after the speech, which they do terribly at, we say, now take the number 1022 and subtract by 13s out loud as fast as you can. And every time they get an answer wrong, they have to start over. So basically, it's 10 minutes of hell. And not surprisingly, their cortisol levels just skyrocket. So now we've got the brain incubating in all of these stress hormones. What happens if we give people a cognitive task, or something to remember? So in this case, what they're trying to learn is a story about a little boy and his mom, and they're leaving home in the morning, and they're going to walk across the park, and everything's fine, everything's neutral, if not positive, until the little boy is hit by a car and both of his legs are severed. Okay, I'm not even going to put the picture up, it's so bad. But like many of our emotional memories, they have negative and neutral components. So if your brain is full of cortisol and you've got the amygdala doing one thing and a hippocampus doing the other, what do you think happens to people's memory? Probably won't surprise you to learn that you have terrible memory for neutral information because your hippocampus isn't working, but you have, again, overly spectacular memory for the emotional. Same thing we saw in the sleep deprivation case. What do these two things have in common? The only way I can get cortisol levels higher in human subjects in the research laboratory, other than that speech task, is to sleep deprive them. Sleep deprivation is incredibly stressful. It secretes a ton of cortisol. There's a reason it's used as a torture technique, okay? But again, I'm not worried about it if you have a stressful day. I'm worried about it if you live under chronic stress that goes on for years, decades, or more. Because what's adaptive in the short term, which is paying excessive attention to the negative, becomes very maladaptive in the long run. So, but you might be wondering, well, how on earth do we go about not being too stressed out? And I think it really starts by understanding that stress is, by its very definition, our response or our reaction to a stressor, okay, that can be perceived or real. It can be something that actually happens to you, or it can just be a stressful thought. Both of those things activate the stress response system and lead to the production of stress hormones. But because it's a response or a reaction to a stressor, this really means that stress to a large degree is under our control. So the important factor seems to be how well a person copes with stress rather than how much stress they face, which brings in this idea and concept of what it means to be resilient. And it turns out we can build up our resiliency by learning to turn on our brain's relaxation response, okay? Now, how do you do that? Well, if I'm worried about you being too stressed out, the first thing I'm going to tell you to do is to protect your sleep, because it's a built-in stress and negative emotion regulator. The second thing is exercise. In fact, when it comes to basic brain mechanics, basic neuronal mechanics, sleep and exercise are two of the best things you can do for your brain. The third actually has to do with social support. It turns out that those of us with richer social support networks actually have lower levels of resting levels of cortisol. And the same is true for those of us who are optimistic. Lower levels of cortisol just even at rest, which puts us in a better position to deal with true stressors when they come. And finally, what I want to focus on here is really those sleep proxies in the form of relaxation training techniques that we know reduce stress and that we actually know protect the brain over time. That can be anything from a relaxation exercise like the progressive muscle relaxation or body scan, where you're envisioning one major muscle group at a time, relaxing. It can be yoga, meditation, just getting outside, going offline. Okay, over time, these are tremendously beneficial for the brain and your general health. So now I'm very quickly, because apparently I am in this time warp, going to talk about really the power of positive emotion, which has been pretty amazing to me because it takes a lot of work to run those stress experiments, but guess how easy it is to put people in a positive mood? You simply smile at them. So let's say you're the control group, you're the experimental group. You come into the lab, I just give you some paperwork to figure out, to fill out. You come in, and I greet you with a warm smile. Maybe I give you a little bag of candy wrapped up in a bow. That's the manipulation. And all of a sudden, you change performance for the better in a whole host of different ways. Okay, all of these things, and especially what we see, is these rather dramatic improvements in creativity, insight, and problem solving. So now I want to give you an example, but first of all, I need to know how many of you are actually in a positive mood right now? Okay, good. All right. So let's see how you do with a task that's called the Remote Associates Test, or the RAT for short. Terrible name, okay? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 3 words up on the screen, and your job is to simply find a 4th word that associates them all. Sometimes it forms a compound word, but not always. Just shout it out when you see the answer. Okay, you ready for the first one? Cracker, Union, Rabbit. Jack. Who said that? Very good. Do you guys see it? Cracker Jack, Union Jack, Jack Rabbit. All right, second one. Note, dive, chair. Really? All right, that's one of the hardest ones we have. High is the right answer. High note, high dive, high chair. Okay, third. Tooth, potato, heart. Sweet, very good. All right, but hold on. Where does your brain want to go when you see tooth and heart? Ache. So here's the thing that positivity does. That's the impasse. That's the garden path we're trying to lead you down. So you're stuck at ache, but then you're like, potato ache? That doesn't work, right? So if you really positivity expands you. If you step outside the box and broaden your purview, you're able to see that there's a better answer, which is sweet. Sweet tooth, sweet potato, sweet heart. And here are the data. It's very clear that the more positive your mood, the more of these problems you solve. But the more we stress you out and make you anxious, the fewer. Okay? So what's my actionable advice for positivity? I wonder what the first thing I'm going to tell you to do if I want you to be more positive is. It's sleep. The second is exercise. The third actually comes back again to social support and connectedness. Remember, you're not a silo. Find those people who make you feel good, because it really does have an effect on the way your brain functions. It's also true that we need to sort of avoid the negative people as much as we can, like my mother-in-law, okay? Optimism. People say you can't learn this. Yes, you can. You want to know how to be more optimistic, how to actually change the way your brain processes information for the better? Every day, you simply do a gratitude exercise where you think of the 3 things that you're grateful for, which on any given day, I promise you, you can do. It changes the way your brain processes information. And then finally, what I want to focus on here is the ability to master known emotion regulation strategies so that you start activating the relaxation response, activating the part of the prefrontal cortex that dials down and puts a brake on the amygdala so that you're less stressed, less negative, and more positive. And there are 3 of them. The first one is simply labeling your emotions. I feel angry. I feel scared. Better yet, once you've labeled the emotion, you do what's called reframe or reappraise it. So the classic example that I like to use is one of traffic. Let's just say, and it's probably kind of true here in Long Island, is let's just say you have an hour commute to work, like each way. And it's stressful and people are honking. I promise you that what you don't want to do is sit in that car calculating the number of days of your life over time that you're losing to this commute, okay? But rather, you reframe it. So it becomes, it's like, it's unavoidable, right? But maybe you've got family obligations on one end, you've got work obligations on the other. Now all of a sudden you transform it so that you're relabeling it as you time, right? So maybe you're like me and you've always wanted to read all the Booker Prize winning novels. That becomes time for you to actually do something you wouldn't have time to do for yourself, otherwise. Maybe you want to learn how, I don't know, electricity works, or you want to learn a new language or how to meditate. Now all of a sudden something that was really stressful and negative and terrible becomes something positive. How many of you have heard of growth mindset? Okay, this is another great way of reframing something. You take something that you perceive as a failure, right? And you own up to it, but then rather than ruminating and focusing on the failure aspect, you focus on how you're going to grow from it. Which is, after all, that's an opportunity for growth if you fail or make a mistake. But by simply changing the way you're attending to it, you're changing the way your brain wires itself so that you can downregulate excessive negativity and stress. So you take a perceived failure, and instead you focus on how you're going to do it better next time, how you're going to learn and grow. And then finally, simply being in the moment. Because guess where 99.999% of our stress comes from? Anticipation and retrospection, right? But if it's in the past, it's done. Like, by all means, figure out what kind of mistake you made, reappraise it, figure out how to make amends, how you're going to do it better, but then let it be in the past. If it's in the future, prepare for it, but then let it go and come back to the moment, which is one of the things that meditation does for us. But people who tend to just stay in the moment just by nature anyway tend to be a lot mentally healthier because they're naturally regulating and not ruminating on all the stressful things I think we can agree are going on out there, in the world right now. So I'm going to leave you, again, with this emphasis on the interconnections between the 3 areas I've talked about today. This is the sleep-stress snowball. The problem is that all 3 of these areas we've discussed today are so interwoven, and enmeshed in your very neurobiology, that for any one of these 3 areas where you suffer for long enough, you're very likely to get deficits in the other areas as well. But the good news is that for any one of these areas where you make a genuine intervention, maybe you're going to decide you're going to get that 28 extra minutes of sleep. Or you're going to start practicing one of these relaxation techniques. Or you're going to learn to reframe. Whatever one of those things you do, if you commit to that for about 5 weeks, because that's how long it takes to build a new habit in the brain, you're very likely to get benefits in the others as well. So now, rather than spiraling around in this sleep-stress snowball, you end up spiraling in a much healthier, happier direction. So I want to encourage you today to think about what's the one thing you might be able to do differently or better that's going to lead to this rather than this. And with that, I want to thank you so much. It looks like I'm very much out of time. And hopefully take some questions.
Professor Jessica Payne from Notre Dame University, thank you very much.